Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, you are the only person who knows the truth about a shell company that doesn't really exist. Its office is a postal box. Its directors are names on paper. But its accounts have moved millions. And someone, somewhere, has been watching you ever since you found the file. You are about to trace a secret that stretches from an abandoned filing cabinet to the quiet of your own conscience. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the rhythm of the rain become the only sound. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The rain had been falling since lunchtime. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady, patient drizzle that streaked the high windows of the old office building and blurred the gray sky into something soft and indefinite. You could hear it tapping against the glass, a quiet, rhythmic sound that seemed to belong to this place as much as the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead or the distant creak of the old elevator in the hallway. The sound had been with you all afternoon, a gentle, insistent presence that filled the silence without breaking it. You had grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to the ticking of a clock in a room where you have spent many hours. The building was mostly empty now. The company had moved to a newer, shinier tower downtown 6 months ago, leaving behind only the archives, a skeleton staff, and you. The moving trucks had come and gone, carrying away the furniture and the computers and the potted plants that had lined the windowsills. What remained was the residue of decades, the things that no one had wanted to deal with, the things that were easier to leave behind. The hallways were dark, the offices stripped bare, the break room silent except for the occasional drip of the old coffee machine that no one had bothered to unplug. It was a strange, suspended atmosphere, a place caught between its past and its inevitable end. You had been assigned to the archives for the past 3 weeks. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that was given to the person who was still relatively new, still proving themselves, still willing to do the things that no one else wanted to do. Your task was simple: sort through the decades of accumulated paperwork, decide what needed to be kept and what could be shredded, and pack the rest into boxes for long-term storage. It was slow, methodical, repetitive work. And in its own quiet way, you had come to find it peaceful. There was a rhythm to it: open the drawer, lift out the files, check the labels, sort them into the keep pile or the shred pile. The work required just enough attention to keep your mind occupied, but not so much that you couldn't let your thoughts drift. The archive room was in the basement, a long, low-ceilinged space lined with gray metal filing cabinets that stretched back into the shadows. The walls were unpainted concrete, cool to the touch, and the floor was covered with a thin, industrial carpet that had been worn down to the weave in places. The air down here was cool and dry, smelling of old paper and dust and the faint, mineral scent of the concrete floor. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling above the central table, casting a pool of yellow light that barely reached the walls. The rest of the room was lost in a soft, gray darkness that seemed to swallow sound and time and the passage of the outside world. When you were down here, you could almost forget that there was a world above, a city outside, a life beyond these cabinets and these files. You had been working your way through the cabinets alphabetically. A through E had taken the first week. F through L had taken the second. Now, in the third week, you had reached the M's. Most of the folders were unremarkable: tax returns, payroll records, old invoices, the quiet bureaucracy of a company that had been doing business for longer than you had been alive. You had fallen into a rhythm: open the drawer, lift out the files, check the labels, sort them into the keep pile or the shred pile. The keep pile had grown tall on the table beside you. The shred pile had grown taller on the floor. The work was monotonous, but there was something satisfying about it, the sense of imposing order on chaos, of bringing light to the forgotten corners of an institution's memory. The rain continued its steady, patient tapping on the high windows. You listened to it as you worked, letting its rhythm mark the passage of time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound so constant that it had become a kind of silence. Occasionally, you heard the creak of the old elevator in the hallway, or the distant click of a door opening and closing somewhere on the floors above. Ooh. No one ever came down here. No one ever interrupted you. The basement was yours, a quiet kingdom of paper and dust. It was in the bottom drawer of the third cabinet that you found it. The drawer was heavy and stuck, and you had to tug hard to get it open. The metal runners groaned in protest, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet of the basement. When it finally slid free, you saw that it was filled with a jumble of folders that had not been touched in a very long time. The labels were handwritten in ink that had faded to a pale, watery brown. Most of them were familiar: more invoices, more tax records, more of the same quiet paper trail. But at the very back of the drawer, wedged beneath a stack of old employee files that had been pressed flat by years of pressure, was a folder that was different from the rest. It was thicker. Heavier. The cardstock cover was a deep, legal blue, the kind that was used for official documents that were meant to last. It was held shut with a length of faded red ribbon that had been tied in a bow and then pressed flat by the weight of everything above it. There was no label on the front. No company name. No filing code. Just a small, handwritten notation in the upper right corner, the ink so faint you had to tilt it toward the light to read it. Registration, 2003. The rain seemed to grow a little louder as you untied the ribbon. The old silk was dry and brittle, and it came apart easily in your fingers, releasing a faint, dry scent of old ink and older paper. The folder fell open on the table before you, its contents spilling out across the worn wooden surface. Certificate of incorporation. A list of directors. A company seal, its embossed design faded but still legible, a stylized bird, perhaps an eagle, encircled by a ring of laurel leaves. A series of bank statements, their columns of figures printed in the precise, unfeeling language of financial institutions. The company name was unfamiliar to you. It meant nothing. It sounded like 100 other corporate names you had seen in 100 other files, a string of words that had been chosen to sound respectable and unremarkable. But as you turned through the pages, your fingers began to slow. The registered address was a post office box in a city you had never visited, a place whose name you recognized only from maps. The listed directors were names that meant nothing to you, printed in the formal, impersonal type of a legal document. There were no photographs, no identifying details, no way to trace who these people were or what connection they had to each other. But the bank statements told a different story. Large sums of money, moving in and out with a regularity that spoke of serious purpose. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, transferred between accounts with a casual indifference that suggested this was ordinary, routine, nothing to remark upon. The account had been opened, used heavily for several years, and then quietly closed. Its paper trail had been left to gather dust in a forgotten drawer, in a basement that no one visited, in a building that had been abandoned by everyone except the person whose job it was to sort through the past. And then, on the very last page, in the space where the company secretary's signature was required, you found something that made your hand pause on the paper. It was not a printed name. Not a stamp. Not a facsimile. It was a real signature, written by a real hand, the ink slightly smudged at the edges as if the pen had paused there for just a moment before lifting away. The letters were formed with a careful, deliberate precision, the hand of someone who had been trained to write well, who had taken his time with each stroke. You recognized the handwriting. You would have known it anywhere. It belonged to your old boss, the man who had hired you when you were fresh out of school and uncertain of everything. The man who had trained you, patiently, in those first few months, showing you how the systems worked, introducing you to the people who mattered, telling you that you had potential. The man who had looked after you, in small, quiet ways, never asking for thanks. The man who had left the company without warning several years ago, clearing out his desk overnight, leaving behind nothing but a few stray papers and a sense of unanswered questions. The man who had not been heard from since. His name, written in his own hand, was at the bottom of a document that should not have existed. The rain tapped softly against the window, a sound that seemed to lean closer, as if it too was reading over your shoulder. The fluorescent lights hummed their quiet, steady note. The basement was still and silent around you. And somewhere deep in the quiet part of your mind, a question was beginning to form, a question about who your boss had really been, and what he had been doing in the years before he disappeared, and why his signature was here, in a forgotten file, in a company that existed only on paper. The folder sat on your kitchen table all evening. You had brought it home with you, tucked into your bag beneath the everyday clutter of your commute, a folded umbrella that was still damp from the morning's rain, a half-read newspaper that you had been meaning to finish for days, a Tupperware container from lunch that you had forgotten to wash. You were not sure why you had taken it. It was not yours to take. The files in the basement were company property, destined for the shredder or the archive, not for the kitchen table of a junior employee who had been assigned to sort through them. But the basement was empty, and the company was gone, and no one else was ever going to look at those files again. And besides, the signature, the familiar, looping letters of a name you had not spoken aloud in years, had stirred something in you that you could not easily set aside. Now, with the rain still falling outside your window and the street lamp casting its familiar amber glow across the worn wooden floor, you sat at your table and let yourself remember him. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip of water from the eaves outside. You had made a cup of tea, and it sat at your elbow, cooling slowly, its steam rising in a thin, curling ribbon that caught the lamplight before vanishing into the shadows above. You had not touched it. Your attention was elsewhere, drawn back through the years, to the man whose signature was on the page before you. His name was Mr. Ellison. No one ever called him by his first name, though you had seen it once on a payroll document that had crossed your desk by mistake, Arthur. He was not the kind of man who invited familiarity. He was tall and thin, with silver-gray hair that he combed straight back from a high forehead, and he wore the same kind of suit every day, dark, well-made, unremarkable. The suit was never wrinkled, never stained, never out of place. It was as if he had a closet full of identical garments, each one waiting to be worn and then discarded when its time was done. He spoke in a low, measured voice, the kind of voice that made people lean in to listen rather than raise their own to compete. He never raised his voice in anger, never laughed too loudly at a joke, never seemed to be in a hurry. There was a stillness about him, a quiet, patient gravity that made him seem older than he was. He was kind, in his way. When you had first joined the company, young and uncertain and desperately afraid of making mistakes, he had taken you aside on your third day and told you, quietly, that everyone felt lost at first. He had told you to give it time. He had said that the work would make sense eventually, and that until it did, you should simply do your best and not be afraid to ask questions. He had been right. In the months that followed, you had gone to him many times, with questions about procedures, with problems you could not solve, with the small, daily uncertainties of a new job. And each time, he had answered with patience and precision, never making you feel foolish, never making you feel like a burden. But he never spoke about himself. Not once, in all the years you worked together, did he mention a wife or a child or a home. He never shared stories from his weekends or his holidays. He never joined the rest of the staff for after-work drinks or birthday celebrations, though he was always polite when invited, always gracious in his refusal. He was there, in the office, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and then he was gone, and no one knew where he went. He was a presence, and then he was an absence, and the space he left behind was so small that it was almost invisible. When he resigned, it happened without warning. One day his office was occupied, his papers neatly stacked on the corner of his desk, his fountain pen resting beside them, his coffee cup, a plain white ceramic mug with a small chip on the rim, sitting on its usual coaster. The next day it was empty. The desk had been cleared. The bookshelves had been stripped. The coffee cup was gone. No farewell party. No goodbye email. No speech in the break room, no handshakes in the hallway, no final words of advice to the colleagues he had worked beside for more than a decade. Just a brief announcement from HR, posted on the intranet and forgotten within a week. Arthur Ellison has left the company to pursue other opportunities. We wish him well. And then silence. He had evaporated, like a drop of water on a hot sidewalk, leaving no trace behind. The rain tapped gently on the window glass, a sound that had become so familiar over the past few days that it felt like a companion. The radiator in the corner hissed its familiar, comforting note, a long, slow release of steam, followed by a series of soft, metallic ticks as the metal cooled. The street lamp outside cast its steady amber glow through the rain-streaked glass, throwing long, wavering shadows across the kitchen floor. You listened to these sounds for a moment, letting them settle around you like a blanket. The house was quiet. The world outside was still. And then you turned the folder over in your hands, feeling its weight, its texture, the faint, dry scent of old paper that seemed to cling to everything that came out of the basement. On the back of the last page, you noticed something you had not seen before. A line of numbers, written in pencil, so faint that they were almost invisible against the yellowed cardstock. The pencil had been pressed lightly, as if the person who had written them had been in a hurry, or had wanted to leave a mark that could be easily erased. Not a phone number, the digits were too many, and they were separated by commas and a decimal point. Not a date. The format was different. You recognized it from somewhere, a geography class in school, perhaps, or a documentary about explorers. Coordinates. Latitude and longitude. The rain seemed to grow a little quieter, as if it too was waiting to see what you would do. You opened your laptop, the screen flickering to life with its pale blue glow, and typed the numbers into a search engine. The satellite image resolved slowly, pixel by pixel, the digital map scrolling across the screen. It showed a small island in the Caribbean, its shoreline ringed with pale sand and darker coral, its interior a dense green tangle of tropical vegetation. The water around it was a brilliant, translucent turquoise, the kind of color you had only ever seen in travel magazines. The only building visible on the island was a low, white structure near the harbor, its red tile roof just barely visible through the palm trees. A label on the map identified it as a trust company, registered to an address in a jurisdiction whose name you had only ever seen on tax forms and financial documents. You sat very still. The coordinates were not random. Someone, Mr. Ellison, you were almost certain, had written them on the back of this document for a reason. They were a signpost. A breadcrumb. A quiet, deliberate trail leading from a forgotten filing cabinet to a building on the far side of the sea. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the glass. You closed the laptop and looked at the folder, at the signature, at the faint pencil marks that were already beginning to fade under the warmth of your fingertips. And the question that had been forming in your mind since you first saw his name on that page was now impossible to ignore. Where had he gone? And why had he left a trail of numbers pointing to a place that most people would never think to look? The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky was still gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the rooftops like a blanket that had been pulled too tight. The streets outside your window were wet and glistening, the pavement reflecting the pale, watery light of a sun that was trying and failing to break through. You could hear the distant hum of traffic on the main road, the occasional call of a bird from the small park at the end of the block, the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the eaves onto the metal windowsill below. It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning that seemed to ask nothing of you, and yet you had been sitting at your kitchen table for nearly an hour, the folder open before you, the faint pencil marks on the back page now slightly more faded than they had been the night before. The warmth of your fingers, resting on the paper as you read and reread the documents, had worn the graphite down a little further. But the coordinates were still legible. The island was still there, a small green dot in a vast blue sea. And the trust company, with its white walls and its red tile roof, was still waiting. You closed the folder and opened your laptop. The screen flickered to life with its familiar pale glow, casting a cool, blue light across the wooden surface of the table. The coffee you had made an hour ago sat at your elbow, long since gone cold, a thin skin forming on its surface. You barely noticed. Your attention was elsewhere, drawn outward, across the sea, to a place you had never been and a secret you were only beginning to uncover. You began to search. The internet, for all its noise and chaos, could be a quiet place if you knew how to use it. You had learned, over the years, to filter out the distractions, to follow the threads that mattered, to let the rest fall away like static on an old radio. You started with the name of the trust company, typing it into the search bar with the same careful deliberation you had once used to file papers in. The basement archive. The results came slowly, the way things often do when you are looking for something that was never meant to be found. The company had a website, a single page, spare and formal, listing its services in the kind of vague, legal language that was designed to reveal nothing. It offered corporate administration. It offered fiduciary services. It offered discretion and confidentiality for discerning clients. Each phrase was polished and precise, a small, smooth stone in a wall that had been built to keep the world at a distance. There were no photographs of the staff. No biographies of the founders. No history of the institution. Just the white building, the red roof, and the quiet assurance that whatever you needed to keep hidden would remain so. The rain had returned by late morning, a soft, intermittent drizzle that tapped gently against the window glass, its rhythm irregular and unhurried. You listened to it as you worked, letting its gentle, unpredictable pattern anchor you to the present even as your mind drifted through the labyrinth of the offshore world. You dug deeper, moving past the surface of the internet into the layers beneath, public registries, corporate databases, the quiet, dusty corners of the digital world where records were stored and forgotten. It was slow work, the kind that required patience and attention, the kind that left your mind free to wander through the implications of what you were finding. What you found was a web. The trust company's name appeared again and again, attached to dozens of other entities, shell companies, each one registered to a different post office box in a different jurisdiction. Some were in the Caribbean, on islands whose names you recognized from the travel brochures you had seen in agency windows. Others were in Europe, in small, landlocked countries whose banking laws were famously discreet. Still others were in Asia, in gleaming financial centers where the towers rose so high that their tops were lost in the clouds. Each company had a different name, a different board of directors, a different stated purpose. But they all shared the same phone number. A single point of contact, threading through the labyrinth like a thin gold wire, connecting everything to everything else. The rain tapped softly on the window as you stared at the screen. You reached for your phone, an old habit, a reflex from the days when you made calls for a living, and dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. You counted the rings, each one a small, hollow echo in the silence of your kitchen. It rang 12 times before disconnecting. No voicemail. No automated message. No invitation to leave your name and number. Just the empty, resonant silence of a line that no one had sworn in a very long time. You set the phone down on the table and watched the screen go dark. The day passed in a quiet, suspended rhythm. You took a walk in the afternoon, following the familiar streets of your neighborhood, letting the cold, damp air clear your head. The rain had softened to a fine mist, barely visible, more a presence than a substance. The trees in the park were bare, their branches glistening with moisture. A few leaves, brown and curled, clung to the pavement. You walked without a destination, letting your feet carry you where they would, and all the while your mind was turning over the fragments of the puzzle you had uncovered. The folder. The signature. The coordinates. The web of shell companies, each one a door that opened onto another door, each one a question that led to another question. And then you thought of someone who might be able to help. An old classmate from university, a man named David, who had gone into financial regulation while you had gone into corporate administration. You had not spoken to him in years, not since a chance encounter at a conference, years ago, when you had exchanged brief, polite words over coffee and promised to stay in touch. You had not stayed in touch. But you still had his email address, buried somewhere in the depths of your contacts list, a relic of a friendship that had faded but never quite ended. You found it, after a long search, tucked between the name of a former colleague and the address of a restaurant you had not visited in years. You wrote to him carefully, choosing each word with the same deliberation you had brought to everything else in this quiet, methodical search. You did not tell him everything, not the folder, not the signature, not the island with its white building and its red roof. You simply asked if he had ever heard of the trust company, and whether he could tell you anything about the entities it managed. You kept your tone light, professional, the kind of question that one former classmate might ask another over a drink. The reply came several hours later, long after the sun had set and the street lamps had flickered on outside your window. The rain had returned with the darkness, a steady, patient drumming on the roof that seemed to fill the silence without breaking it. You had made another cup of coffee, and this one was still warm, its steam rising in a thin, curling ribbon that caught the glow of the desk lamp. Your laptop chimed, a small, soft note, and you saw David's name on the screen. The message was brief. Just a few lines, typed in the careful, measured language of someone who understood the weight of what he was sending. There was no greeting. No small talk. No inquiry about how you had been or what you were doing these days. Just the words, and the attachment that waited Ben. Eat them. I'm attaching a file. It's an internal investigation dossier, the kind of thing that never gets released to the public. Read it if you want. But you should know, fewer than 5 people have ever seen what's in here. Once you open it, you'll be one of them. Choose carefully. The rain tapped softly against the glass. You sat very still, the cursor hovering over the attachment. The coffee cooled beside you. The street lamp outside cast its steady amber glow through the rain-streaked window. Outside, the world was dark and quiet. Inside, your kitchen was warm and still. And somewhere, in the depths of a server on the far side of the city, a file was waiting, a file that contained answers to questions you had not yet learned to ask. Your hand rested on the mouse. The cursor blinked. And you knew that whatever choice you made next, there would be no going back. The attachment sat on your screen for a long time before you opened it. You had read David's message 3 times, each pass through those careful, measured sentences settling deeper into your chest, like stones dropped into still water. Fewer than 5 people have ever seen what's in here. Once you open it, you'll be one of them. Choose carefully. The words echoed in the quiet of your kitchen, a small, persistent refrain that refused to fade. The rain had returned with the darkness, a steady, patient drumming on the roof that seemed to fill the silence without breaking it, a sound that had accompanied you through every step of this journey so far. The street lamp outside cast its familiar amber glow through the rain-streaked glass, throwing long, wavering shadows across the wooden floor. The house was still. The world outside was quiet. And the file was waiting. You did not open it immediately. You were not sure if it was hesitation or patience. Perhaps it was both. You made a fresh cup of coffee, the familiar ritual of grinding the beans and boiling the water a small comfort in the midst of so much uncertainty. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, warm and bitter and grounding. You wrapped your hands around a ceramic mug, feeling the heat seep into your fingers, and you walked to the window. The rain was falling steadily, not hard but persistent, the kind of rain that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The street below was empty, the pavement glistening under the amber glow of the street lamps. A single car passed, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt, its taillights disappearing into the dark. You thought about your old boss. His name was Arthur Ellison, and you had worked beside him for nearly 3 years without ever really knowing him. He was kind, in his quiet way. Patient. Meticulous. He had a habit of adjusting his glasses when he was thinking, pushing them up the bridge of his nose with his index finger, a gesture so small and so familiar that you had stopped noticing it long before he left. He kept a notebook on his desk at all times, a small, leather-bound book with a worn cover and yellowed pages, filled with his careful, precise handwriting. You had seen him writing in it often, usually at the end of the day, when the office was quiet and the fluorescent lights were humming their soft, gray note. You had never asked what he was writing. It had not seemed like your business. And then, one day, he was gone. No warning. No farewell. Just an empty office and a few stray papers and the faint, lingering scent of his cologne. You had been the one to help clear out his desk, a task that had fallen to you because you were the newest person on the team, the one who could not say no. You had packed his belongings into a cardboard box, his fountain pen, his spare glasses, the framed photograph of a landscape you did not recognize, the small potted plant that had sat on his windowsill. And his notebook. You had held it in your hands for a moment, feeling its weight, its texture, the worn smoothness of its leather cover. You had flipped it open, just a glimpse, just a page, and you had seen a drawing. A lantern, its flame sketched with a few quick strokes of a fountain pen. Beneath it, in his familiar, steady hand, were the words, "Silence is golden." You had closed the notebook and placed it in the box, and you had not thought about it again. Until now. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the roof. The coffee was growing cold in your hands. You walked back to the table, set the mug down, and sat before your laptop. The attachment was still there, waiting. You took a breath, slow and deep, the kind of breath you might take before stepping into a cold river, and you opened the file. The document was long, dozens of pages, each one filled with the dense, clinical language of a financial investigation. The formatting was stark and unadorned, tables of figures, bullet point summaries, the occasional footnote citing a source that had been redacted. It was not meant to be read by the public. It was meant to be read by people who already understood what they were looking at. But you read it anyway, slowly, carefully, letting the shape of it emerge from the details. The trust company you had found, the one with the white walls and the red tile roof on the small Caribbean island, was not just a passive administrator of offshore entities. It was the hub of a wheel. The shell companies you had discovered, the dozens of entities registered to post office boxes across the globe, were the spokes. And the money that flowed through them was the rim, connecting everything to everything else. The file traced each transaction, each transfer, each quiet, invisible movement of capital through the labyrinth. It was a map of a hidden economy, a secret geography of wealth that had been operating in the spaces between the official and the visible for years. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars, moving from accounts in Zurich and Singapore and the Cayman Islands, passing through shell company after shell company until their origins were so thoroughly obscured that no one could trace them back to their source. And at the center of it all, signing off on every major transaction, was a single name. Not a real name. Not the name of a person who could be found or questioned or held accountable. A code. A cipher. The lantern bearer. The rain drummed softly on the roof above you. The radiator in the corner clicked once, twice, and then fell silent. The street lamp outside continued its steady amber glow through the rain-streaked glass. You stared at the words on the screen, the lantern bearer, and somewhere, in the quiet, methodical workings of your memory, a connection was being made. You had seen that name before. Not in this file. Not in any of the documents you had uncovered in the basement. You had seen it in your old boss's notebook. The one he had left behind on his desk when he disappeared. The one with the worn leather cover and the yellowed pages. The one you had held in your hands for just a moment, on the day you helped clear out his office. You remembered it clearly now. The drawing of the lantern, its flame rendered in quick, confident strokes. The words beneath it, written in his familiar, steady hand. Silence is golden. And beneath that, smaller, almost as an afterthought, a single line. The lantern bearer remembers. If your eyes are growing heavy, let the rain carry you for a while. The file will still be here when you wake. The numbers will still be waiting. The lantern bearer's secret has been kept for all these years. It can keep a little longer. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain wash over you, gentle and slow, like a hand smoothing down a crumpled page. The story will still be here when you return. The rain continued its soft, patient rhythm against the glass. You closed the file and sat very still in the quiet of your kitchen. The coffee was cold. The night was deep. The street lamp outside cast its steady amber glow, and the world beyond your window was silent and still. The notebook was still out there somewhere, tucked into a box, perhaps, in the back of a closet, in the attic, in the basement, waiting to be found. You had packed it away years ago, along with the rest of his belongings, and you had not thought about it since. But you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that you were going to find it. You were going to hold it in your hands again, and you were going to read every page. And you were going to learn, at last, who the lantern bearer really was. The attic was cold and dim, lit only by a single bare bulb that swung gently on its cord when you pulled the chain. The light cast long, wavering shadows across the sloping rafters and the stacks of cardboard boxes that had been pushed against the walls over the years. The air smelled of old wood and dust and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender sachets your mother had placed in boxes decades ago and had long since forgotten. The rain was still falling outside, drumming softly on the roof above you, a sound that had become so familiar over these past days that it felt like a companion, steady, patient, asking nothing. You could hear it pattering against the shingles, running through the gutters, dripping from the eaves onto the wet ground below. It was the same rain that had been falling since the night you first opened the file in the basement. It felt as though it had been falling forever. You had not been up here in years. The boxes were stacked against the sloping rafters, their cardboard softened by damp and time, their labels written in the fading marker of a person you used to be. Kitchen, 2014. Books, 2015. Winter clothes, 2016. Each label was a small, faded monument to a version of yourself that no longer existed. You had come up here to store things, over the years, and you had never come back to retrieve them. The attic had become a museum of your own past, a quiet repository of everything you had chosen to forget. You were looking for the notebook. The one you had held in your hands on the day Mr. Ellison's office was cleared out. The one with the worn leather cover and the yellowed pages and the drawing of a lantern on one of its earliest leaves. You remembered holding it, briefly, before placing it in a box with the rest of his belongings, his fountain pen, his spare glasses, the small potted plant that had sat on his windowsill. You had carried that box up here, pushed it into a corner, and left it. And you had not thought about it again. Until tonight. The rain drummed steadily on the roof above you, a sound that seemed to fill the attic without disturbing its stillness. The bare bulb cast its pale yellow glow, and the dust motes drifted slowly through the light like tiny, silent creatures. You began to search, moving from box to box, lifting lids, peering inside. Old tax returns. Bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. A child's drawing, its crayon colors still bright despite the years. A broken clock. A set of china wrapped in newspaper from a decade you barely remembered. Each box was a small excavation, a quiet unearthing of things that had been buried and forgotten. It took you nearly an hour to find it. The box was tucked behind a stack of old photo albums and a broken lamp, its cardboard softened by years of humidity, its corners reinforced with yellowed packing tape that had long since lost its grip. The label on the side, written in your own handwriting, read simply, Mr. Ellison's office, 2018. You lifted the lid, feeling the dry, fragile texture of the old paper beneath your fingers. His fountain pen was still there, its nib crusted with dried ink. His spare glasses, their lenses smudged and dusty. The small potted plant, long since reduced to a skeleton of dry twigs and brittle leaves. And there, beneath them all, was the notebook. You drew it out carefully, feeling its familiar weight in your hands. The leather cover was worn smooth in places where his hands had held it, darkened by years of handling. The spine was cracked but intact, the binding still holding. You sat down on an old wooden crate beneath the attic's single window, the rain tapping gently on the glass above you, tracing slow, silver paths down the pane. The light from the bare bulb was just enough to read by. You opened the notebook. And you began. The notebook was not a diary. It was not a journal in the ordinary sense. There were no dates, no descriptions of weather or meals or the small, daily events of a life. It was a record. Meticulous, precise, the work of a man who had been trained to keep careful accounts and who had applied that training to his own private world. Pages of abbreviations and sums of money, written in his familiar, steady hand. The amounts were large, startlingly large, even after everything you had seen in the encrypted file. The transactions were complex, involving multiple accounts, multiple jurisdictions, multiple layers of obfuscation. This was not personal finance. This was the management of a network. And threaded through the numbers, appearing at irregular intervals like stitches in a wound, were fragments of something else. Not accounts. Not records. Reflections. Quiet, troubled questions addressed to no one in particular, written in the margins, squeezed between columns, tucked into the blank spaces at the bottom of pages. Is it enough to do no harm? He had written on one page, the ink pressed deep into the paper as if he had been gripping the pen too hard. If I simply manage the flows, if I never touch the money myself, am I complicit in what it does? You turned the page. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the glass, a sound that seemed to lean closer, as if it too was reading over your shoulder. I told myself I was protecting people, he had written several pages later. The clients. The employees. The ones whose names never appear on any document. If I stopped, someone else would take my place. Someone less careful. Someone less concerned with the consequences. I told myself that staying was the lesser evil. And then, further on, in a hand that trembled slightly, the letters less steady than before, I have become what I once despised. The money I manage has done things I cannot undo. It has reached places I cannot follow. I see the headlines and I know, that some of those transactions passed through my ledgers. I am not innocent. I am only invisible. And invisibility is not the same as absolution. The rain seemed to grow quieter for a moment, as if it too was absorbing the weight of his words. You sat very still on the wooden crate, the notebook open in your lap, the dust motes drifting through the pale yellow light around you. The attic was silent except for the rain and the faint creak of the old timbers settling in the cold. You thought about Mr. Ellison, not the distant, formal figure you remembered from the office, but the man who had written these words. A man who had carried a burden for years, alone, in silence, and who had left behind this notebook as the only record of his conscience. And then, on the very last page, tucked into the fold of the binding where the paper met the leather, you found something you had not noticed before. A photograph. It was old, its edges slightly curled, its colors faded over the years to soft, muted shades of sepia and pale gold. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, her dark hair pulled back from her face, her eyes looking directly into the camera with a calm, steady, unflinching gaze. She was standing in front of a house you did not recognize, a small, white house with green shutters and a garden full of flowers. Her expression was difficult to read. Not quite a smile. Not quite solemn. Something in between. Something patient. You turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting you recognized, the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the notebook's pages, were the words, "Give this to her. She deserves to know her father was not a bad man." You stared at the photograph for a long moment. The rain continued its soft, steady rhythm against the glass above you. The bare bulb hummed its quiet, electrical note. The young woman's face was familiar. It took you a moment to place it, a moment in which the world seemed to hold its breath, and then the recognition settled over you like a chill, like the cold air that seeped through the attic's old walls. She looked like your cousin. The one you had lost touch with years ago, the one whose family had drifted away from yours for reasons no one had ever explained. The one whose father had left when she was still young, and who had grown up never knowing why. And now, holding the photograph in your hands, you were beginning to understand. Mr. Ellison was not just your old boss. He was her father. And the notebook in your lap was not just a record of transactions and regrets. It was a message. A confession. And a plea. Give this to her. She deserves to know. The first sign that something had changed was the phone call. It came on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set and the street lamps outside your window were flickering to life, their amber glow casting long, soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. You had been sitting at your kitchen table, the folder from the basement open before you, the notebook beside it, the encrypted file still glowing on your laptop screen. The rain had been falling all day, a soft, persistent drizzle that streaked the window glass and blurred the world outside into something soft and impressionistic. It was the kind of rain that seemed to have no beginning and no end, the kind that made the indoors feel like a sanctuary and the outdoors feel like a memory. The phone rang twice. Not your mobile, your landline, the number you had kept for years out of habit, the number that only a handful of people ever called. You reached for it without thinking, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number or perhaps the elderly neighbor downstairs who sometimes called to ask if you could help her with a stuck window. But when you answered, there was no one there. No voice. No breathing. No background noise of any kind. Just the faint, hollow hum of an open line, a sound that seemed to stretch on for much longer than it actually did, and then the soft, final click of disconnection. You stood there for a moment, the phone in your hand, listening to the silence on the other end of the line. Then you set it down and went back to your work. Wrong number, you told yourself. It happened all the time. The rain continued its steady, patient drumming on the roof, a sound that seemed to fill the silence without breaking it. You thought nothing more of it. But it happened again the next night. The phone rang at the same hour, just as dusk was fading into dark. The same silence. The same hollow hum. The same soft click. And when it happened a third time, and a fourth, you began to leave it unanswered. The ringing would stop after a few seconds, 4 rings, no more, no less, and then the silence would return, and the rain would fill the room once more. You told yourself it was a glitch, a malfunction in the old phone lines that ran through the walls of your building. But somewhere, in the quiet, instinctive part of your mind that had been trained by years of sorting through other people's secrets, you knew that it was not. The second sign was the letter. You found it on a gray Thursday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery store flyer in the mailbox at the end of your front path. The mailbox was old, its metal surface pitted with rust, its red flag bent at an angle that made it impossible to raise. You had been meaning to replace it for years and had never gotten around to it. The letter was a plain white envelope, the kind you could buy at any stationery store for a few cents. It was unmarked, no address, no name, no return, and unsealed, its flap simply tucked inside. It bore no stamp and no postmark. Someone had walked up to your door, opened your mailbox, and placed it there by hand. Perhaps in the night. Perhaps in the early hours of the morning, when the street was empty and the rain was the only sound. You opened it, feeling the dry, crisp texture of the paper beneath your fingertips. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. You unfolded it, expecting a message, a warning, perhaps an explanation. But the page was blank. No words. No signature. No mark of any kind. Just the empty, patient white of a sheet that was waiting to be filled. You stood in the doorway of your apartment, the envelope in one hand and the blank page in the other, and you listened to the rain tapping gently on the awning above you. The street was quiet. The mailbox stood at the end of the path, its metal surface beaded with moisture, reflecting the pale gray light of the overcast sky. The houses across the road were dark, their curtains drawn, their occupants either still asleep or already gone for the day. There was no one in sight. No car idling at the curb. No figure retreating around the corner. But someone had been here. Someone had walked up to your door, opened your mailbox, and left this empty message for you to find. And the emptiness itself was the message. We know where you live. We know what you found. You began to take precautions. It was not a conscious decision, exacto. Why, not the result of a single moment of resolve. It was more like an instinct, a quiet, practical response to a situation that you did not yet fully understand. You had read enough history to know that information, once discovered, could not be undiscovered. And you had seen enough of the world to know that people who had power did not like to lose it. You made copies of everything. The folder, with its certificate of incorporation and its bank statements and its familiar, looping signature. The encrypted file that David had sent you, the one that fewer than 5 people had ever seen, the one that traced the flow of hundreds of millions of dollars through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. The notebook, with its fragments of Mr. Ellison's conscience, the quiet, troubled questions he had written in the margins, the confessions he had hidden between columns of numbers. You scanned each page, each document, each file, and you saved them to 3 separate USB drives. Each one was small, no larger than your thumb, and each one contained within it the entire story of what you had uncovered. You placed the first USB in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. The bank was an old, solid building with marble floors and brass fixtures and the quiet, discreet atmosphere of a place that had been keeping secrets for a very long time. The box was small, just large enough to hold a few documents, and it was secured behind a door that required 2 keys to open. You kept one key. The bank kept the other. You placed the second USB in a sealed plastic container, and you buried it at the base of an old oak tree in the park near your apartment. The tree was ancient, its trunk wide and gnarled, its roots spreading deep into the earth. You had walked past it 1,000 times without ever really noticing it. Now, you would never forget where it was. You chose a spot on the north side of the trunk, where the roots formed a small, sheltered hollow, and you covered the container with soil and leaves and a single, smooth stone that you had brought from the riverbank. The third USB, you kept on your keychain. It was small and unobtrusive, a tiny rectangle of black plastic that looked like nothing more than a memory stick. But it was the most important of the three. It was the one you would always have with you. The one you would reach for if you ever needed to prove, to someone, that what you had found was real. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the roof. The days passed in a quiet, suspended haze, a strange, liminal period in which the ordinary routines of your life continued while, beneath the surface, everything felt different. You went to work. You came home. You checked your mailbox and your phone and the locks on your door. You listened to the rain, and you waited, and you tried not to think about the blank page in the envelope, or the silence on the other end of the phone line, or the feeling that someone was watching you. And then, one night, you came home to find something that had not been there when you left. The door was locked, as you had left it. The windows were closed, their latches secure. Nothing in the apartment had been disturbed, not the books on the shelves, not the dishes in the sink, not the coat hanging on its hook by the door. But on your desk, placed carefully in the center of the worn wooden surface, as if it had been arranged there with deliberate, unhurried precision, was a single sheet of paper. You had not left it there. You had never seen it before. The handwriting was neat and precise, the letters formed with a care that suggested someone who had been trained to write well. The ink was dark, almost black, and it had not yet fully dried. When you touched the edge of a letter with your fingertip, it smudged slightly, leaving a faint gray mark on your skin. The message was brief. We know what you know. You may join us, or you may remain silent forever. The lantern bearer needs you. Beneath the words, resting on the paper as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a small copper badge. It was old, its surface tarnished with age, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. The metal was cool and solid in your palm, heavier than it looked. And the image embossed on its face was still clear, despite the years of wear. A lantern, its handle raised, its flame burning bright against the darkness. The rain tapped gently on the window glass. You picked up the badge and held it in your palm, feeling its weight, its coolness, the faint, metallic scent of old copper. The street lamp outside cast its steady amber glow through the rain-streaked glass. The house was silent around you. And you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that the choice you had been avoiding was now impossible to postpone. The photograph sat on your desk for 3 days before you acted on it. The young woman's face, faded to sepia and pale gold by the passage of years, had become as familiar to you as your own reflection. You had studied every detail, the calm, steady gaze that seemed to look directly into the camera without flinching, the dark hair pulled back from her face in a simple, practical style, the small white house with green shutters that stood behind her, its garden full of flowers whose colors had long since faded from the print. And you had read the words on the back so many times that you could recite them from memory, each letter etched into your mind like a groove worn into stone by years of water. Give this to her. She deserves to know her father was not a bad man. The rain had stopped at last, though the sky was still gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the rooftops like a blanket that had been pulled too tight. The streets outside your window were wet and glistening, the pavement reflecting the pale, watery light of a sun that was trying and failing to break through. You could hear the distant hum of traffic on the main road, the occasional call of a bird from the small park at the end of the block, the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the eaves onto the metal windowsill below. It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning that seemed to ask nothing of you. And yet you had been sitting at your kitchen table for nearly an hour, the phone in your hand, scrolling through your contacts until you found the name you were looking for. Your cousin. The one you had not spoken to in more than a decade. The one whose family had drifted away from yours for reasons no one had ever explained, or perhaps for reasons that no one had wanted to explain. You remembered her from childhood, a quiet girl with dark hair and serious eyes, who had always seemed older than her years. You had played together at family gatherings, running through the gardens of your grandparents' house, while the adults talked in low voices in the kitchen. And then, sometime in your teenage years, her family had stopped coming to those gatherings. There had been no argument, no falling out that you could recall. Just a gradual, quiet withdrawal, like a tide going out and never returning. You had not thought about her in years. But now, holding the photograph in your hands, you understood that her absence had been part of a larger story, a story you were only now beginning to uncover. You dialed before you could talk yourself out of it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring a small, hollow echo in the quiet of your kitchen. You could feel your heart beating in your chest, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to match the ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the clouds shifted, and a thin shaft of pale sunlight broke through the gray, casting a long, golden rectangle across the wooden floor. It was the first sunlight you had seen in days. And then a voice answered. A voice you recognized, though it was older now, more tired, more careful than the voice you remembered from childhood. She said your name, and there was something in her tone that sounded almost like relief, as if she had been waiting for this call for a very long time, and had almost given up hope that it would ever come. You spoke for a while about small things, the weather, the years that had passed, the ordinary details of lives lived apart. She told you that she had moved to a small town in the mountains, where the air was clean and the winters were long and the neighbors knew each other by name. She told you that she worked as a librarian now, spending her days surrounded by books and silence and the quiet, patient work of cataloging. She asked about you, and you told her what you could, about the company, the move, the basement archives, the file you had found in the bottom drawer. You did not tell her everything. Not yet. But you told her enough. And then, carefully, choosing each word with the same deliberation you had brought to every step of this journey, you asked her if she had ever known a man named Arthur Ellison. The silence that followed was different from the pauses that had come before. It was deeper. Heavier. You could hear the faint, distant sound of wine through the phone line, and the soft, irregular tick of a clock in a room you had never seen. When she spoke again, Her voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet that you had to press the phone close to your ear to hear her. "He was my father," she said. "But he was not a bad man." The rain had begun to fall again outside your window, a soft, hesitant drizzle that tapped gently against the glass. You listened to it for a moment, letting the sound settle around you like a blanket, letting her words find their place in the quiet of the room. Then you asked her to tell you more. She told you that her father had come to see her once, several years ago. It was the middle of the night. She remembered that detail clearly, because she had been woken by the sound of knocking on her door, and when she opened it, he was standing there in the dark, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. He had not come inside. He had not sat down. He had simply handed her an envelope, sealed with wax, and told her that if he ever stopped contacting her, if the phone calls stopped, if the letters stopped, if the occasional, unexpected visit stopped, she should take the envelope to a person he trusted. A person who would know what to do with it. He had given her your name. She had asked him why. She had asked him where he was going, and what was in the envelope, and why he could not stay. But he had not answered. He had simply kissed her on the forehead, told her that he loved her, and walked away into the night. She had not seen him since. The envelope, she said, was still in her possession. She had kept it all these years, unopened, in a drawer beside her bed. She had been waiting, she said, for the phone call that would tell her it was time to open it. And now, hearing your voice on the other end of the line, she wanted to know if you were ready. The rain continued its soft, steady rhythm against the window. You sat very still in the quiet of your kitchen, the phone pressed to your ear, the photograph on the desk before you. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break apart, and the first pale rays of afternoon sunlight were slanting through the gaps, illuminating the wet pavement and the dripping leaves of the trees. And you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that you were going to see her. You were going to drive to the mountains, to the small town where she lived, and you were going to open the envelope together. And you were going to learn, at last, what Arthur Ellison had left behind. The drive to the mountains took the better part of a day. The roads wound upward through stands of pine and birch, their branches bare and glistening with the last of the morning's rain. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the clouds hanging low over the ridges, and the air that slipped through the crack in your window was cold and clean, carrying the faint, resinous scent of the forest. You drove with the radio off, listening to the steady hum of the engine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling somewhere overhead. The road was mostly empty. You passed through small towns with names you had never heard of, their main streets lined with hardware stores and diners and post offices with faded American flags fluttering in the damp breeze. Each town was a brief interruption in the endless green of the forest, a small cluster of human habitation that appeared and then disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. You stopped once, at a gas station on the edge of a town called Millbrook, to fill the tank and buy a cup of coffee. The coffee was hot and bitter, and you stood outside for a moment, leaning against the car, drinking it slowly while the rain fell around you in a fine, gentle mist. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine needles and the faint, distant smoke of a wood stove somewhere in the valley below. You watched a pair of crows circle the parking lot before settling on the roof of the station, their black feathers glistening with moisture. Then you got back in the car and drove on. You found a cafe on the edge of the next town, just as your cousin had described it on the phone. It was a modest place, tucked between a used bookstore and a shop that sold handmade candles, its windows fogged with steam and warmth. The sign above the door was wooden and hand-painted, its letters faded but still legible, and it swung gently in the breeze, creaking on its old iron hinges with a sound that was soft and rhythmic and oddly comforting. Inside, the A.I.R. smelled of fresh coffee and old wood and the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon. A few tables were scattered across the worn wooden floor, their surfaces scarred with the rings of countless cups. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth at the far end of the room, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The only other customer was an old man reading a newspaper in the corner, his glasses perched low on his nose. The rain had begun to fall again outside, a gentle, persistent drizzle that tapped against the window glass and blurred the world beyond into something soft and impressionistic. You could hear it on the roof, a steady, patient rhythm that seemed to wrap itself around the warmth of the cafe like a blanket, holding the cold at a distance. She was waiting for you at a table in the corner, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked older than the photograph, of course. The years had left their marks on her face, in the fine lines around her eyes and the gray that streaked her dark hair. But her eyes were the same. Calm. Steady. Patient. The same eyes that had looked into the camera all those years ago, in front of a small white house with green shutters. She smiled when she saw you, a small, hesitant smile that seemed to carry the weight of all the years you had lost. You noticed that her hands, resting on the table beside the teacup, were trembling just a little. You sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of you spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, a log shifting and sending up a small shower of sparks. The rain tapped gently on the window. The old man in the corner turned a page of his newspaper. The waitress, a young woman with a ponytail and a green apron, came by and poured you a cup of coffee without being asked, as if she understood that this was not a moment for words. And then your cousin reached into her bag, a worn leather satchel that had been resting on the chair beside her, and withdrew an envelope. It was old, its paper yellowed and soft at the edges, sealed with a circle of dark red wax that had cracked slightly with age. The wax bore the faint impression of a seal, though the design was too worn to make out. She held it for a moment, looking at it as if she was saying goodbye to something she had carried for a very long time. Then she placed it on the table between you. "I've been waiting a long time to open this," she said. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but there was a steadiness in it that surprised you. "He gave it to me years ago. He told me to keep it safe, and to wait. He said that someday, someone would come. Someone who knew what to do with it." She paused, her eyes meeting yours across the table. "I didn't want to open it alone." You nodded. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the window. The fire crackled softly. And together, with the warmth of the cafe wrapped around you and the weight of the years pressing gently on your shoulders, you broke the seal. The letter inside was written on several sheets of paper, folded neatly, the ink faded over the decades to a pale, watery brown. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the notebook, the same steady letters that had signed the registration document in the bottom drawer of the basement archive. Mr. Ellison's hand. Arthur Ellison. The lantern bearer. He began without preamble. No greeting. No apology. Just the truth, set down in the same methodical, precise language he had used to keep the ledgers for so many years. He wrote that he had been, for more than 2 decades, the chief accountant for a vast offshore financial network. He had managed the books for dozens of shell companies, routing money through a labyrinth of jurisdictions so complex that no single authority could ever trace it. He had been good at his job, too good, perhaps. He had believed, in the beginning, that he was simply providing a service, that the clients he served were no different from any other wealthy individuals seeking privacy and protection from the prying eyes of governments and tax authorities. He had told himself that he was a facilitator, not a participant. A technician, not a criminal. But over time, he had come to understand what the money was really doing. He had seen the bribes that toppled governments and the corruption that starved communities and the quiet, systematic destruction of lives that happened far from the headlines, in places whose names never appeared in any newspaper. He had watched the numbers move across his ledgers, numbers that represented not just wealth, but power, and not just power, but violence. And he had known, with a certainty that grew heavier with each passing year, that he could not continue. So he had decided to leave. But leaving was not simple. The people he worked for did not accept resignations. They did not allow retirement. They allowed only silence, or death. He had known this. And so he had planned his desap. Parents carefully, over many months. He had collected evidence, years of it, stored in a place where no one would think to look, and he had hidden it, waiting for the right person to come along. Someone who would finish what he had started. Someone who would carry the lantern forward. Let this letter settle quietly in your mind now. Arthur Ellison has been running for a very long time. His words are here, on this paper, but his footsteps have faded into the distance. You don't need to decide anything tonight. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain on the cafe window carry you for a while, gentle and slow, like a hand smoothing down a crumpled page. I chose you, the letter continued, in a hand that grew slightly less steady as it neared the end, because of all the people I have ever known, you were the one who would never stop looking. You were the one who would go to the bottom drawer, and open the folder, and ask why. I saw it in you from the first day you walked into my office. You have a mind that does not accept easy answers. You have a heart that does not turn away from difficult questions. And now, I am passing the lantern to you. Carry it carefully. And do what you think is right. The letter was signed, simply, the lantern bearer. The date beneath the signature was from a year ago. He had written this letter knowing that someday, somehow, you would find it. He had trusted you with the final piece of his legacy. And tucked into the fold of the last page, held in place by the pressure of the years, was a small brass key. Its handle was engraved with a number. A locker number. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the window. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its flames reflected in the polished surface of the table. Your cousin was watching you, her eyes calm and patient, her hand still wrapped around her teacup. And you held the key in your palm, feeling its familiar weight, its cool solidity, the promise of what it would unlock. You understood that the next step was already waiting for you. The locker was out there, somewhere, and the key in your hand was the way to find it. The key was cold in your palm, its brass surface worn smooth by years of waiting. You had held it for so long now, through the drive back from the mountains, through the quiet hours in your apartment, through the long night when you had sat at your kitchen table and turned it over and over in your fingers, that it had taken on the warmth of your skin. But there was still a small, cool weight at its center, a reminder that it belonged to something you had not yet found. The number engraved on its handle, 317, had become as familiar to you as your own name. You had traced its digits with your thumb 100 times, wondering what they would unlock. And now, standing in the nearly empty bus terminal of a small coastal town with the gray sea stretching out beyond the windows, you were about to find out. The town was the kind of place that existed at the edge of things, the edge of the land, the edge of the map, the edge of the world that most people bothered to visit. It had a single main street, lined with weathered storefronts and a diner that had been serving the same menu since the 1950s. The houses that climbed the low hills behind the harbor were painted in faded pastels, their roofs streaked with rust, their gardens overgrown with wild roses and tangled ivy. The sea was everywhere, you could smell it in the air, a constant, briny presence that seeped into your clothes and your hair, and you could hear it in the distance, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to breathe with the town itself. The rain had stopped for the first time in days, but the sky was still gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the water, and the pavement beneath your feet was slick with moisture. The terminal was a low, weathered building on the edge of the harbor, its walls painted the pale green of a hospital corridor. The paint was peeling in long, thin strips, curling away from the plaster like the pages of an old book. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their soft, gray note, a sound that seemed to belong to this place as much as the salt and the sea. The air inside smelled of diesel and damp concrete and the faint, metallic tang of the vending machine that stood against the far wall, its coils filled with candy bars and bags of chips that had been there for who knew how long. A few plastic chairs were scattered across the linoleum floor, their surfaces cracked and faded by years of sunlight. An elderly woman sat in one of them, her hands folded over a plastic shopping bag, her eyes fixed on the distant schedule board that listed departures for towns whose names you had never heard of. She did not look at you as you passed. No one did. The town was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where the coming and going of strangers was as unremarkable as the tide. You found the lockers at the back of the terminal, in a narrow corridor that smelled of damp concrete and old newspapers and the faint, sweet scent of something that might once have been flowers. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single bulb that hung from the ceiling on a frayed cord, casting long, unsteady shadows across the walls. The lockers were arranged in rows, their metal doors scuffed and dented by years of use, their numbers stenciled in fading black paint. Some of the doors had names written on them in marker, or stickers that had been half peeled away, leaving behind only a ghostly residue. Most of the lockers hung open, empty, their interiors dark and silent. But near the bottom, in the corner farthest from the light, where the shadows gathered and the sound of the sea was just barely audible through the concrete walls, was number 317. Its door was closed. Its lock was intact, a simple mechanism, unremarkable, the kind that had been installed decades ago and had never been replaced. You knelt before it, feeling the cold of the concrete seep through the fabric of your trousers, and you fitted the key into the slot. The key slid in smoothly, without resistance, as if the lock had been waiting for it. You turned it. The mechanism released with a soft, satisfying click that seemed to echo in the stillness of the corridor, a sound that was final and satisfying and somehow alive. Inside the locker was a waterproof duffel bag. Its canvas was stiff with age, its color faded from whatever bright hue it had once been to a pale, washed-out gray. The zipper was rusted but still functional, and when you pulled it open, it released a faint, dry scent of old paper and older secrets. You lifted the bag out carefully, feeling its weight, heavier than you expected, dense with the years of evidence it had carried. You carried it to a bench near the window at the far end of the terminal, where the gray light of the overcast sky fell softly across the worn wooden slats. You sat down. The terminal was quiet. The elderly woman had gone, her bus departed or perhaps never arrived. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady, patient note. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, a soft, salt-scented drizzle that blurred the line between the sea and the sky, that turned the harbor into a watercolor of gray and silver and pale, muted blue. You could hear it tapping gently on the metal roof above you, a sound that had accompanied you through every step of this journey. It felt like a companion now. A witness. A quiet, patient presence that asked nothing and offered everything. You opened the bag. Inside were dozens of ledgers, their leather covers worn smooth by years of handling, their pages filled with the same careful, deliberate handwriting you had come to know so well, the handwriting of Arthur Ellison, the lantern-bearer. Each ledger was a record of transactions, a map of money moving through the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. The amounts were staggering, but it was not the numbers that held your attention. It was the names. He had written down everything, every client, every intermediary, every quiet, invisible hand that had touched the money as it passed through the network. He had built a record of an empire, piece by piece, over years of patient, dangerous work. Beneath the ledgers were hundreds of scanned documents, their images crisp and clear despite the years. Bank statements. Incorporation papers. Emails. Photographs. They were the evidence, the proof, the quiet, indisputable testimony of a man who had decided to stop running and start fighting. And beneath them all, at the very bottom of the bag, was a photograph. It was old, its edges slightly curled, its colors faded to sepia and pale gold. It showed a group of men in dark suits, seated around a polished conference table in a room with high ceilings and tall windows. They were all looking at the camera, their expressions calm and unreadable. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting you recognized, were their names and titles. Some of them you knew. They were the faces that appeared in the financial pages, the men who moved markets and shaped economies, the men whose decisions rippled outward to touch millions of lives. Arthur Ellison had not just collected evidence. He had built a map of accountability, a quiet, patient record of who had done what, and when, and how. He had documented the entire network, from its origins to its operations, from its leaders to its enablers. And he had left it here, in a locker by the sea, waiting for someone to come and find it. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the metal roof above you. You sat very still on the wooden bench, the photograph in one hand and the key in the other, the weight of what you had found settling into your chest like a stone dropped into still water. The terminal was quiet. The sea breathed in the distance. And you understood, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that the lantern had been passed to you at last. The question now was what you would do with its light. The duffel bag sat on the floor of your apartment for a full day before you touched it again. You had carried it home from the bus terminal on your lap, one hand resting on its canvas surface as if it might disappear if you let go. The drive back had been quiet, the rain falling in steady, silver sheets, the road winding through the dark, the radio silent. You had passed through the same small towns you had passed through on the way out, their lights blurred and softened by the storm, their streets empty. And when you had finally pulled into your own driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath your tires had felt like a kind of homecoming, or return to a world that was still, for the moment, ordinary. Now, in the warmth of your kitchen, with the street lamp outside casting its steady amber glow through the rain-streaked window and the radiator humming its quiet, metallic song, you knelt beside the bag and began to unpack what Arthur Ellison had spent years collecting. The canvas was cool and rough beneath your fingers, its surface still carrying the faint, salty scent of the sea. The rain was falling steadily outside, a sound that had become so familiar over these past weeks that it felt like a second heartbeat, a quiet, patient rhythm that had accompanied you through the basement, through the archives, through the long drive to the mountains and back again. It was the sound of this journey. It was the sound of everything you had discovered and everything you had yet to decide. You worked slowly. There was no reason to hurry. The evidence had been waiting for years. It could wait a little longer. You spread the contents of the bag across your kitchen table, the ledgers first, their leather covers worn smooth, their pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. Then the scanned documents, hundreds of them, each one a small, precise record of a transaction or a communication or a decision made in a room far away. Then the laptop, its casing scratched but intact, its battery long since drained. You organized them by date, by subject, by the names of the people involved. You took notes on a yellow legal pad, the same kind you had used when you were first learning to sort through the files in the basement. The work was slow and methodical, the kind of work that required patience and attention, the kind that left your mind free to wander through the implications of what you were finding. The first day, you focused on the ledgers. They were the foundation, the raw data, the numbers that told the story of money moving through the network. Each entry was recorded in Arthur's careful, deliberate hand. Dates. Amounts. Account numbers. The names of shell companies that existed only on paper, in jurisdictions whose banking laws were famously discreet. The totals were staggering. You had known, from the encrypted file David had sent you, that the sums involved were large. But seeing them here, in Arthur's own handwriting, made them real in a way that the digital file had not. This was not an abstraction. This was a record of actual money, moving through actual accounts, touching actual lives. The second day, you moved on to the scanned documents. These were the details, the bank statements, the incorporation papers, the emails, the photographs. They filled in the gaps that the ledgers had left open. They showed who had authorized each transfer, who had signed each document, who had met in which boardroom to decide where the money would go next. The level of detail was extraordinary. Arthur had been thorough, obsessively so. He had left no stone unturned, no connection undocumented. He had built a complete picture of the network, from its origins to its operations, from its leaders to its enablers. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the window glass. The radiator hummed its quiet, metallic song. The days passed in a quiet, suspended haze, a strange, liminal period in which the ordinary routines of your life continued while, beneath the surface, everything felt different. You went to work in the mornings, sat through meetings, answered emails. You came home in the evenings, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and read. You took more notes. You read some more. And the more you read, the more you understood the weight of what you were carrying. This was not a simple case of tax evasion. It was not a matter of wealthy people hiding money from the government, of accountants finding clever loopholes in the tax code. The network Arthur had documented was a machine, a vast, intricate system designed to move money through the global economy without leaving any trace. It had been used for far more than simple evasion. It had been used to fund bribes, payments made to government officials in countries whose names rarely appeared in the headlines. It had been used to facilitate insider trading, with information passed between shell companies and offshore accounts before it ever reached the public markets. It had been used to channel illegal contributions into political campaigns, money that flowed from corporate treasuries into the pockets of candidates who would, once elected, return the favor with legislation and deregulation and the quiet, patient work of dismantling the rules that had been built to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. The names in the ledgers were not anonymous. They were the names of people you recognized, people whose faces appeared in the financial pages, people who moved markets and shaped economies, people whose decisions rippled outward to touch millions of lives. You had seen them on television, in newspapers, in the glossy profiles that celebrated their success. And now, here they were, in Arthur Ellison's careful handwriting, their secrets laid bare. He had not just collected evidence. He had built a map of accountability, a quiet, patient record of who had done what, and when, and how. He had documented the entire network, and he had entrusted it to you. You understood, too, that this knowledge was not without risk. Arthur had disappeared for a reason. The people whose names were in these ledgers had resources, money, lawyers, influence. They would not simply accept exposure. They would fight. They would deny. They would do whatever they could to protect themselves and the machine they had built. And if they knew that you held the evidence, they would come for you. The rain tapped gently on the window glass, a sound that seemed to lean closer, as if it too was waiting for you to decide. You sat at your kitchen table, surrounded by the ledgers and the documents and the quiet, patient weight of everything you had learned, and you thought about what to do next. You thought about calling David, the old classmate who had sent you the encrypted file. You thought about calling a journalist, someone who would know how to handle this kind of information. You thought about calling the authorities, though you were not sure which authorities would have the jurisdiction or the will to act. And then, tucked between 2 pages of a ledger near the bottom of the pile, you found a small slip of paper. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, as if Arthur had written it quickly, in a moment of quiet urgency. Testimony does not always require a courtroom. Sometimes it only requires a CL. Dear conscience. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the glass. You set the note down beside the ledgers, and you thought about your cousin, and about the words she had spoken in the cafe in the mountains. He was not a bad man. He just took a wrong path, and spent the rest of his life trying to find his way back. You understood now what she meant. Arthur had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, perhaps, but he had spent his final years working to undo them. He had collected this evidence not for revenge or for profit, but for justice. He had wanted the truth to come out. He had wanted the people he had helped to be held accountable. And he had trusted you to finish what he had started. You set the note down beside the ledgers and walked to the window. The rain was falling steadily, its rhythm soft and unhurried. The street lamp outside cast its amber glow across the wet pavement, and the houses across the road were dark and quiet. The world was still. The choice was yours. And you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that Arthur had already shown you the way. Not to a courtroom. Not to a journalist. But to your own conscience. The question was simple. What would you do with the truth when you were the only one who held it? The decision came to you not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet settling. Like the rain that had been falling since the night you first opened the folder in the basement, steady, patient, unhurried. It had been with you through every step of this journey, from the dusty filing cabinet in the archive room to the bus terminal locker by the sea, from the cafe in the mountains to the kitchen table where you now sat, surrounded by the evidence that Arthur Ellison had spent years collecting. And now, at the end of all those miles, it was still here, still falling, still softening the edges of the world. You had thought, at first, about taking the evidence to the authorities. It was the obvious path, the one that any reasonable person would have chosen. You had imagined yourself walking into a government building with the ledgers under your arm, handing them over to a serious-looking man in a dark suit, and watching as the machinery of justice ground into motion. But the more you considered it, the more you understood the risks. A single agency, a single prosecutor, a single jurisdiction, any of them could be compromised. Any of them could bury the evidence, or leak it to the wrong people, or simply let it disappear into the slow, grinding machinery of a system that had been designed to protect the powerful. Arthur had known this. It was why he had never gone to the authorities himself. It was why he had hidden the evidence and waited for someone he could trust. You could not trust a single point of failure. So you built a network of your own. You began with the financial regulators, not just one, but several, in different countries, each with overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. You chose them carefully, researching their track records, their independence, their willingness to pursue difficult cases. You sent them the ledgers, the bank statements, the incorporation papers, everything they would need to open formal investigations. You did not use your own name. You created anonymous email accounts, routed your messages through encrypted servers, covered your tracks with the same meticulous care that Arthur had once used to hide the money itself. Each message was brief and factual, containing only the evidence and a short explanation of what it showed. No threats. No demands. Just the truth, laid out in clear, unemotional language, waiting to be acted upon. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm against the window glass. You worked through the mornings and into the afternoons, the light shifting slowly across the walls of your apartment. The radiator hummed its quiet, metallic song. The coffee in your cup grew cold, and you replaced it with fresh, and that cup grew cold as well. You barely noticed. Your attention was fixed on the task before you, on the quiet, methodical work of sending the truth out into the world. Then you reached out to journalists. Not just any journalists, you had seen too many stories buried by editors who lacked the courage to publish them. You chose the ones who had spent their careers investigating financial crime, the ones who had sources and credibility and the courage to publish stories that powerful people did not want published. You found their contact information through their publications, through their professional profiles, through the quiet, interconnected network of people who believed that journalism was a public trust. You gave them the same evidence you had given the regulators, packaged differently, with clear explanations of what each document showed and how the pieces fit together. You trusted them to verify it, to contextualize it, to bring it to the public in a way that would be impossible to ignore. And finally, you sent the evidence to academic researchers, the economists and political scientists and legal scholars who studied the shadow networks of global finance. Their names were less famous than the journalists, but their work was no less important. They would analyze the data, publish papers in peer-reviewed journals, testify before legislative committees, build a body of knowledge that would outlast any single news cycle. They would make sure that the story of what Arthur had uncovered would not be forgotten, would not be buried, would not be dismissed as the work of a single, unreliable whistleblower. They would give it the weight of scholarship, the permanence of the academic record. The work took you several days. You worked from your kitchen table, the rain drumming softly on the roof above you, the street lamp outside casting its amber glow through the rain-streaked glass. You took breaks only when your eyes grew too tired to focus, when your fingers began to ache from typing, when the weight of what you were doing pressed too heavily on your chest. You would walk to the window and stand there for a while, watching the rain fall, watching the droplets trace their slow, silver paths down the pane. Then you would return to the table and continue. You did not tell anyone what you were doing. Not your cousin, who had trusted you with her father's letter. Not David, the old classmate who had sent you the encrypted file and warned you to choose carefully. Not a single soul. You carried the weight of it alone, the weight of the evidence, the weight of the decision, the weight of the consequences that would follow. And you found, to your quiet surprise, that you were strong enough to bear it. Arthur had carried his burden for years, alone in the silence of his own conscience. You could carry yours for a few days more. Now you can close your eyes. The emails have been sent. The evidence has been passed on. Your testimony is complete. You don't need to be in a courtroom to speak the truth. You have spoken it already, in the quiet of your own mind, in the stillness of your own heart. The rest belongs to time, and to the truth, and to the quiet, unstoppable power of what happens when someone decides to do the right thing. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain wash over you, gentle and slow, like a hand smoothing down a crumpled page. The last email went out just after midnight. You closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of your kitchen, listening to the rain. The house was still. The street outside was empty, the pavement glistening under the amber glow of the street lamps. The world was asleep, and you were awake, and the truth was already beginning to move through the vast, invisible architecture of the global financial system. You reached across the table and picked up the old photograph of Arthur Ellison, the one that had been tucked into his notebook, the one that showed him standing beside his daughter in front of a small white house with green shutters. You looked at his face for a long time, at the calm, steady eyes, at the faint, hesitant smile that seemed to carry the weight of everything he had done and everything he had failed to do. "I passed the lantern on," you said quietly, "to the photograph, to the silence, to the rain. Just like you asked." You set the photograph down on the table, and you placed the small brass key, the key that had opened the locker by the sea, beside it. The key and the photograph, side by side, the two objects that had guided you through the final steps of this long journey. Then you stood, walked to the stove, and put the kettle on to boil. The sound of the water heating was a small, ordinary comfort, the kind of sound that belonged to a life that was returning, slowly, to normal. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the roof. The night was quiet. And somewhere, in server rooms and inboxes and the offices of people who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of truth, the evidence was waiting to be opened. The lantern had been passed. The light was still burning. And you, at last, could rest. The weeks that followed were quiet. The news broke slowly, the way a tide comes in, first a ripple, barely noticeable, a small item buried in the financial pages that most readers would skip without a second glance. Then a wave, gathering strength, as more outlets picked up the story and the scope of what had been uncovered began to reveal itself. Then a steady, unstoppable surge that reshaped the shore, as regulators announced formal investigations, as executives resigned without explanation, as the machinery of accountability ground slowly but inexorably into motion. You watched it unfold from your kitchen table, the same table where you had first opened the folder from the basement, where you had traced the coordinates to the island in the Caribbean, where you had read Arthur Ellison's letter and made your choice. The rain had become a constant companion now, falling softly on the roof, streaking the window glass with silver, filling the silence with its gentle, patient rhythm. The first headlines appeared in the financial press, cautious, measured, the kind of language that lawyers reviewed before publication to ensure that every statement was defensible. Regulators launch investigation into offshore network. Several high-profile executives named in leaked documents. The names you recognized were there, printed in black and white, their carefully constructed reputations beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. You read each article slowly, the way you had once read the files in the basement, letting the words settle into your mind. You felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Only a quiet, steady sense that something which had been broken for a very long time was beginning, at last, to be repaired. The days passed in a quiet, unhurried rhythm. You went to work in the mornings, taking the same bus you had always taken, walking the same streets you had always walked. You came home in the evenings, hung your coat on its hook by the door, and made coffee in the kitchen while the rain tapped softly against the window glass. You walked through the familiar streets of your neighborhood on the weekends, watching the seasons shift, watching the last leaves fall from the trees and gather in damp, golden drifts along the curb. The ordinary rhythms of your life continued, and you found that you were grateful for them in a way you had never been before. The ordinary had become a kind of refuge, a reminder that the world was still here, still turning, still capable of small, quiet joys. A cup of coffee on a cold morning. A book read by lamplight. The sound of rain on the roof at night. The investigation spread outward, touching more and more of the people whose names had appeared in Arthur's ledgers. You followed the news, but you did not seek it out. You let it come to you, the way you let the rain come, the way you let the seasons change. You had done what you had set out to do. The evidence was in the hands of people who would use it well. The rest was beyond your control, and you had made your peace with that. One evening, as the rain began to fall again outside your window, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the street lamps into halos of pale gold, you walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of your study. It was an old cabinet, its drawers heavy and smooth on their rollers, the same cabinet you had used for years to store tax returns and insurance papers and the quiet bureaucracy of an ordinary life. You pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that was almost never used, and you took out the folder. The one from the basement. The one with the blue cardstock cover and the faded red ribbon that had come apart so easily in your fingers on that first night. You held it for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight, its familiar texture, the faint, dry scent of old paper that still clung to its pages. You thought about everything that had happened since the night you had found it, the phone calls, the letters, the long drive to the mountains, the locker by the sea, the weight of the evidence and the quiet, patient work of sending it out into the world. You thought about Arthur Ellison, the man who had signed his name on the last page, who had carried the burden of his secrets for so many years, who had trusted you to finish what he had started. You thought about your cousin, who had waited so long for someone to come and tell her that her father was not a bad man. Then you closed the folder and placed it in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old utility bills and a file of receipts from a car you no longer owned. You pushed the drawer shut. And the sound it made, a soft, solid thump, felt like an ending. Not a sad ending. Just the quiet, ordinary ending of a story that had been told and was now complete. You walked to the window and stood looking out at the rain. The street lamp outside cast its amber glow across the wet pavement, and the houses across the road were dark and still, their windows blank, their occupants asleep or settling in for the night. The trees that lined the street were bare now, their branches glistening with moisture, their last leaves long since fallen and scattered by the wind. The world was quiet. The world was at peace. And you, standing at the window with your hands in your pockets and the warmth of the radiator at your back, felt a deep, quiet sense of calm settle over you. It was not the calm of having all the answers. It was the calm of having done what you could, and of being willing to let the rest go. And then the phone rang. The sound was startling in the quiet of the room, a sharp, insistent note that seemed to come from another world. You let it ring twice before you crossed to the table and picked it up. The screen showed no caller ID. Just a blank, empty space where a name or a number should have been. For a moment, you simply held the phone in your hand, listening to the silence on the other end of the line. The same silence you had heard so many weeks ago, when this journey had first begun, the silence of an open line, of a person who was there but not speaking, of a presence that was waiting for something. But this time, after a long, quiet moment, a voice spoke. A voice you recognized, though you had not heard it in years. It was older now, more tired, but still steady. Still calm. Just a single word. Thank you. And then the line went dead. You stood there for a long moment, the phone in your hand, listening to the silence that followed. The rain continued its steady, patient rhythm on the roof. The street lamp outside cast its amber glow through the rain-streaked glass. The world was quiet. The world was still. And you smiled, a small, quiet smile that no one else would ever see, and set the phone back down on the table. You walked to the bedroom and lay down on the bed, pulling the covers up around your shoulders. The rain drummed softly on the roof above you, a sound that had accompanied you through every step of this journey. It was the sound of discovery. The sound of decision. The sound of quiet, patient work and of a story that had finally found its ending. The lantern had been passed. The light was still burning. And somewhere, in the darkness, a man who had spent his life running was finally able to rest. Good night.